In November 2022, in Atlanta, Georgia, a woman was killed inside her own home. The victim was 31-year-old Cornishia Perkins, a mother of four. The person responsible was not a stranger but her spouse, 32-year-old Shakyia Perkins, with whom she had been in a 6-year relationship. Court records show that the relationship had a documented history of violence. In 2021, Shakyia was charged with arson after setting fire to Cornishia's Mercedes-Benz. Additional charges included aggravated assault, terroristic threats, and criminal damage to property. A restraining order was issued requiring Shakyia to stay 200 yards away. Despite this, she was later released on a $70,000 bond. The months leading to the crime included reports of stalking and continued threats. Social media posts added another layer, with cryptic messages suggesting unresolved conflict. The restraining order remained in effect, but enforcement gaps allowed contact to continue. On the day of the killing, witnesses reported that Shakyia retrieved a gun from her car. Moments later, Cornishia was shot inside her residence. Authorities responded, and an investigation began that tied the shooting directly to the ongoing pattern of domestic violence. The case did not proceed to trial. Instead, Shakyia entered a guilty plea, accepting a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole under Georgia law. That sentence requires a minimum of 30 years before eligibility for review.
New at 6, a Channel 2 Action News exclusive. Look closely. For the first time, we're seeing video of a woman retrieving a gun moments before she murdered her wife. She's now pleaded guilty to the crime, and Channel 2 investigative reporter Mark Winnie is live in Midtown Atlanta. Mark, there were allegations of domestic violence before the murder, but that suspect got out on bond.
Yeah, a prosecutor with the Fulton County DA's Domestic Violence Division says while the video shows the killer getting the gun moments before this murder, his experience looking at abusive relationships shows how often victims sadly stay in or return to a relationship even as the violence escalates.
This outcome closed the legal process, but questions remain. Why was bond granted despite repeated violence? Why was a restraining order not enough to prevent access? And how many warnings were overlooked before the final act occurred? Stay with us as we unravel this shocking story and uncover the heartbreaking details of what led to this senseless loss. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what are your thoughts as the story unfolds? Welcome to True Crime Tales, where we reveal the crimes that shock communities and the secrets hidden behind closed doors. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's begin. Corneshia Perkins was a 29-year-old mother of four at the time of her death in 2022. She grew up in Georgia and was closely connected to her family and community. Relatives describe her as someone who placed her children at the center of her life, ensuring their needs came first regardless of circumstances. Her upbringing was rooted in strong family ties, and she remained in close contact with siblings and extended relatives. As an adult, Cornishia balanced her role as a mother with her efforts to create stability for her household. She worked to support her four children, although specific career records are limited in public reporting. Her income, like many single parents, was stretched across childcare, school needs, and housing, yet she maintained a household where children were provided for. Her four children varied in age, ranging from young elementary school students to early teens. She played an active role in their education and daily routines. Neighbors recalled her attending school functions and maintaining a consistent presence in their lives. Reports indicate that incidents of conflict between her and her partner sometimes unfolded in front of these children, highlighting how deeply the instability of her relationship impacted the household. Friends and relatives described her as a woman who appeared outwardly strong, but who had been dealing with ongoing private struggles within her relationship. On social media, she portrayed an image of resilience and positivity. Posts highlighted family activities and a desire for forward progress, while concealing the more turbulent aspects of her personal life. This created a contrast between her public image and her private reality, where legal protections and repeated conflicts with her partner defined much of her later years. Cornishia met Shakyia Perkins approximately 6 years before the fatal incident. The relationship developed into a long-term partnership that, according to family, was characterized by both affection and instability. Over time, their union became marked by recurring conflicts, episodes of control, and signs of volatility that escalated in severity. Initially, the relationship was perceived as stable, with both women investing in their bond. However, patterns of control and aggression began to surface early on. Friends of the victim later reported that Cornishia experienced periods where she became isolated from her family and social circle, a common sign in abusive partnerships. The relationship was also complicated by jealousy and arguments over finances. These stressors contributed to repeated cycles where disputes escalated into threats or physical incidents, followed by brief reconciliations. The pattern established a cycle that would later prove dangerous, with aggression returning after short periods of calm. Throughout their 6 years together, those close to Cornishia recognized ongoing turbulence. The dynamics include expressions of love and shared history, but they were undermined by repeated aggressive episodes, intimidation, and destructive behavior. The relationship escalated beyond verbal conflict into documented acts of violence. Police and court records detail multiple incidents involving Shakyia. Reports show that violent episodes were not isolated but formed a recurring pattern that intensified over time. The history of violence between Corneshia Perkins and her wife, Shakyia Perkins, did not begin with the fatal shooting in November 2022. One of the most documented prior incidents was the arson of Cornishia's vehicle. In 2021, investigators reported that Shakyia deliberately set fire to Cornishia's Mercedes-Benz. This act followed a series of threats and confrontations in their deteriorating relationship. Alongside arson, charges were filed for aggravated assault, terroristic threats, and criminal damage to property. Shakyia was arrested, and the court reviewed her history of violent behavior toward Cornishia. Despite the seriousness of the charges and the documented threats, a bond was set at $70,000. The conditions tied to her release were specific. The court ordered that Shakyia must avoid all contact with Cornishia and maintain a distance of at least 200 yards from her at all times. This condition was designed to protect Cornishia and her children from further harm, given that some violent incidents had already taken place in front of the children. The decision to grant bond raised immediate concerns. Members of the community and observers questioned whether the amount and the conditions reflected the danger posed. Critics argued that the combination of arson, stalking, and assault created a clear pattern of escalating violence. Some legal experts noted that while bond is a standard right in most criminal cases, judges are also tasked with considering public safety and risk to specific victims. In this instance, they questioned whether those considerations were weighed heavily enough. Reports following her release indicated that enforcement of the bond conditions was limited. Monitoring was minimal, leaving responsibility largely on the victim to report violations. This created an ongoing risk, as restraining orders and bond restrictions are only effective when violations are acted upon. In the months that followed, this lack of close monitoring became evident. As time moved toward November 2022, Shakyia's behavior did not suggest compliance with court restrictions. Instead, reports describe a pattern of stalking behavior. Neighbors and witnesses claimed that she appeared near Cornishia's residence on multiple occasions, despite the court-mandated distance requirement. These appearances were uninvited and created ongoing fear and instability in Cornishia's life. Shakyia's social media activity also raised red flags. In the days before the murder, she posted cryptic and ominous messages. Phrases about starting again and forgetting the past circulated, hinting at a possible shift in mindset or preparation for a final act. While such posts are often dismissed as vague or ambiguous, in retrospect they read as indicators of intent. Cornishia reportedly continued to face harassment even after the restraining order was granted. There were suggestions that she received unwanted messages, and that Shakyia kept trying to insert herself into her daily life. Whether all of these violations were formally reported to police remains unclear, but what is consistent is that no effective intervention took place. This gap highlights a systemic problem. Protective orders and bond conditions are often presented as safeguards, yet enforcement depends on swift police response and strict judicial oversight. In this case, the absence of enforcement left Cornishia exposed. Despite repeated threats of violent criminal history and visible signs of continued harassment, the system remained silent. The fatal sequence unfolded in the early hours of November 17, 2022. Reconstructing the timeline provides a clearer picture of how the events progressed. Shakyia arrived at Cornishia's home. The restraining order was still active, and her presence was itself a violation. Despite this, there was no barrier preventing her entry. Reports indicate that she was not accompanied by anyone else, and her movements were purposeful. At the time, witnesses were present inside the residence. Among them were some of Cornishia's children. Their presence added another layer of danger, as prior incidents of abuse had occurred in their view. Moments before the murder, Shakyia retrieved a firearm from her vehicle. This act was deliberate and premeditated, marking a shift from confrontation to lethal intent. Returning into the home with the weapon, she shot Cornishia in the head. The precision of the act left no doubt about the intended outcome. The scene erupted into chaos following the gunshot. Emergency calls were made to police. When police responded to reports of shooting inside her Atlanta residence. Upon arrival, officers located Cornishia with a gunshot wound to the head. Emergency medical personnel pronounced her dead at the scene.
New at 6, a Channel 2 Action News exclusive. Look closely. For the first time, we're seeing video of a woman retrieving a gun moments before she murdered her wife. She's now pleaded guilty to the crime, and Channel 2 investigative reporter Mark Winnie is live in Midtown Atlanta. Mark, there were allegations of domestic violence before the murder, but that suspect got out on bond.
Yeah, a prosecutor with the Fulton County DA's Domestic Violence Division says while the video shows the killer getting the gun moments before this murder, his experience looking at abusive relationships shows how often victims sadly stay in or return to a relationship even as the violence escalates.
In the Perkins case, it is a wife who kills her wife. There had been escalating violence.
In November 2022, Shakyia Perkins shot out of the house she shared with her wife, Corneshia Perkins, stalked to her car, and came back with a gun in her left hand. Then Shakyia shot Cornishia in the head and killed her, says Fulton County Senior Assistant District Attorney Travis Thomas.
Pretty soon after we showed that video, she decided to take the plea.
He says last month, Shakyia Perkins pled guilty to murder and more.
She ultimately pled to life with the possibility of parole. That was a plea deal that was offered. So she admitted everything.
Thomas says though they shared the bond of matrimony on the day of the murder, Shakyia Perkins should not have been near her wife because Shakyia was out on bond totaling $70,000 on charges of aggravated assault, criminal damage to property, terroristic threats, felony, and arson first degree. Conditions including must not come within 200 yards of the victim in those alleged incidents, which was Cornishia.
She tried to run Cornishia off the road in her car, and this all happened within months of this incident. Also, there was an incident where she set Cornishia's car, she had a Jeep, set her car on fire in a driveway.
Thomas says in the vehicle arson, a person believed to be Shakyia Perkins can be seen on doorbell video in the vicinity of the fire. And in another incident, she kicked the door of a residence where Cornishia temporarily stayed. The prosecutor says charges relating to the alleged incidents before the murder were dismissed since Shakyia Perkins agreed to plead guilty in the murder case and accept a life with the possibility of parole sentence. Prosecutor Thomas told us he's a former Army officer who did 2 tours in Iraq. But his work as a domestic violence prosecutor in Fulton County has showed him the toll escalating violence can take.
Recognize domestic violence and seek help. There's a lot of organizations out there that will help.
A transcript indicates the defense said, "My client has never been in real trouble before. You know, this was a toxic relationship that I think both families just wish that they had gone their separate ways. And it's just not what happened. They kept trying to work it out." District Attorney Fonnie Willis.
We here in Fulton County need to do what they've done all across the country and create a family justice center so the victims here, when they are going through this abuse, they have somewhere to go and resources to help them to rebuild their lives.
Now, I guess we're in one of those pop-up showers that Brad just talked about. In 2022, we covered that bond a judge gave in the earlier alleged incidents, a statement then attributed to Fulton County District Attorney Fonnie Willis said, in part, my office opposed bond in this case. Cases involving domestic violence often involve ongoing danger to the victim. We tried to reach out in a number of ways to the defense attorney today. Reporting live, Mark Winnie, Channel 2 Action News.
Officers immediately secured a perimeter and began collecting physical evidence while identifying potential witnesses present in or around the property. The first step of the investigation was to recover the firearm used in the killing. Police located a handgun inside the residence, later confirmed through ballistic testing to have fired the fatal shot. Spent bullet casings were also recovered near the victim's body, establishing trajectory and confirming close-range firing. Investigators collected latent fingerprints from both the weapon and other surfaces in the home. The fingerprints were analyzed and matched to Shakyia Perkins, the spouse of the victim. Witness testimony played a central role in reconstructing the events. Neighbors reported hearing a loud argument inside the home, followed by a single gunshot. Some neighbors stated they had seen Shakyia outside the home earlier that morning, before re-entering shortly before the shooting occurred. Inside the residence, Cornishia's children were present. Although their testimony was limited by age, police documented consistent accounts that their mother and Shakyia had been arguing prior to the incident. These accounts corroborated both neighbors' statements and physical evidence. Investigators also examined prior documentation, particularly restraining order records. Cornishia had previously obtained a protective order against Shakyia, citing threats, stalking, and prior act of violence, including arson. The restraining order legally required Shakyia to remain at least 200 yards from Cornishia and her residence. Detectives found that the restraining order had been violated multiple times before the killing. Reports of stalking behavior and harassment had been documented in the months leading up to the incident, indicating an ongoing pattern of violations that escalated unchecked. With the forensic evidence, witness testimony, and history of documented threats, police quickly identified Shakyia Perkins as the primary suspect. She was taken into custody and transported for questioning. The district attorney's office then began preparing formal charges based on the evidence compiled. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office formally charged Shakyia Perkins with murder, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, and multiple counts related to her prior actions, including bond violations tied to the earlier arson case. The prosecution presented the killing as a deliberate act, supported by evidence that Shakyia retrieved the firearm from her car moments before shooting Cornishia inside the home. In court, prosecutors highlighted Shakyia's prior criminal charges. These included aggravated assault, terroristic threats, arson, and criminal damage to property, all stemming from incidents involving Cornishia during their 6-year relationship. Court records showed that Shakyia had been released on a $70,000 bond with strict conditions, including staying away from Cornishia. Despite this, she repeatedly approached the victim, violating those bond conditions. The court acknowledged these violations as part of the broader context of escalating violence that culminated in the murder. Discussions arose regarding the failures of the bond system and the inadequacy of protective measures. Prosecutors noted that despite Cornishia's restraining order and reports of stalking, enforcement mechanisms were weak. These issues became central to legal arguments about the state's handling of high-risk domestic violence cases. As the case proceeded, the prosecution offered a plea deal. Instead of pursuing a full trial, they proposed a life sentence with the possibility of parole. The plea was designed to secure accountability without forcing the victim's family, particularly her children, to endure the stress of testifying in a lengthy trial. It also eliminated the risk of potential legal challenges or appeals that could arise from a contested verdict. Shakyia accepted the plea deal, formally admitting guilt to the murder of Corneshia Perkins. The agreement required her to serve a life sentence, with eligibility for parole after serving the minimum term required by Georgia law. Courtroom proceedings included statements from the prosecution, defense, and presiding judge. The prosecution presented the case as one with overwhelming evidence of guilt. The defense emphasized the plea as an act of acceptance of responsibility. The judge confirmed the sentence, ensuring that the terms were clear: life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. With this, the case avoided trial and concluded with sentencing. The murder of Cornishia Perkins left a significant impact on her family, especially her 4 children. With their mother killed and her spouse incarcerated, the children were abruptly displaced from their home environment. Immediate arrangements had to be made for their care, with extended family members stepping in to provide stability. Family members publicly expressed their grief and frustration over the loss. In court statements, they described the permanent void left by Cornishia's death. They also referenced the repeated warnings she had given about the danger posed by Shakyia, noting that protective measures had not been enough to prevent the tragedy. For the children, the impact was particularly severe, having lived in an environment marked by repeated domestic violence incidents, some occurring in their presence. They were already exposed to trauma before the killing. Witnessing arguments, threats, and physical violence shaped their experiences. The murder further compounded this trauma, leaving them with both the memory of their mother's death and the loss of parental figures in their daily lives. Extended family members assumed responsibility for raising the children, ensuring they remained in a supportive environment. Legal custody arrangements were made to provide stability and continuity. Reports from family members indicated efforts to shield the children from ongoing media coverage and legal discussions surrounding the case. In broader terms, the family impact extended beyond the immediate household. Relatives, friends, and community members emphasized that Cornishia had been a mother, daughter, and sister whose absence reshaped family dynamics. Her death became not only a private tragedy, but also a case study in systemic gaps in domestic violence protections. The murder of Corneshia Perkins drew swift reaction from the community, advocacy groups, and the media. Domestic violence organizations highlighted the case as a clear illustration of the dangers victims face even after seeking legal protection. Local advocates in Atlanta pointed out that Cornishia had pursued restraining orders and reported prior incidents of abuse. Yet those protective measures did not stop her death. Advocacy groups used the case to stress the need for reforms and how the justice system monitors offenders who repeatedly violate bond conditions. National domestic violence awareness organizations also cited the case. They referenced the broader pattern of victims being killed shortly after protective orders are filed. For these groups, Cornishia's murder became an example in campaigns calling for improved enforcement of restraining orders, better communication between courts and law enforcement, and stricter bail requirements for violent offenders. Media coverage quickly spread from Atlanta outlets to national networks. Local reports outlined the timeline leading up to Cornishia's death, documenting the arson of her car, the restraining order, and the bond that allowed her abuser to remain free. National reporting framed the case within the larger discussion of domestic violence, examining gaps in the system. Commentaries questioned why bond was approved for a defendant already accused of aggravated assault, arson, and threats. Community members also responded directly. Vigils were organized in Cornishia's memory. Family, neighbors, and supporters gathered to remember her life, while drawing attention to the failures that preceded her death. Memorials highlighted her role as a mother of 4 and underscored the lasting impact on her children. Local organizations tied these gatherings to calls for reform, urging lawmakers to revisit how restraining orders are enforced. The combination of advocacy statements, media investigations, and public vigils shaped the community's reaction into a sustained demand for accountability. The murder was no longer seen as an isolated event, but as part of a recurring pattern of preventable tragedies. The Perkins case revealed specific failures within the domestic violence system. The first issue centered on restraining orders. In theory, a restraining order is designed to create a protective barrier between victim and abuser. In practice, enforcement depends heavily on compliance and timely response from law enforcement. When an offender violates the order, consequences are not always immediate or severe. In Cornishia's case, the order requiring Shakyia Perkins to stay 200 yards away did not prevent continued harassment, stalking, and ultimately, the fatal encounter. Bond decisions formed another critical failure point. Courts are tasked with weighing the presumption of innocence against the risk an accused individual poses to victims and the public. Despite prior charges that included arson and aggravated assault, bond was set at $70,000 and granted. This allowed Shakyia to remain free, with restrictions that proved ineffective. Critics later questioned why bond was issued given the violent history and escalation behavior. The balance leaned toward the offender's freedom rather than the victim's safety. The lack of monitoring for high-risk offenders compounded the problem. While conditions were attached to the bond, including no contact provisions, enforcement mechanisms were limited. There was no constant surveillance or electronic monitoring in place to ensure compliance. Without these tools, violations went undetected or unenforced until it was too late. Patterns of escalation were another overlooked factor. Domestic violence often follows a cycle that increases in severity over time. The destruction of property, threats, and stalking should have signaled progression toward lethal violence. However, this pattern was not addressed with the urgency it required. By the time Cornishia's case reached its fatal point, multiple opportunities for intervention had already passed. The systemic weaknesses highlighted by this case are not unique, but reflective of broader challenges in how domestic violence cases are managed. Domestic violence in same-sex relationships remains an area that is often overlooked or minimized within public discourse and legal frameworks. Many victims in such relationships report difficulty in being taken seriously, facing assumptions that violence is less dangerous in same-sex dynamics. This perception contributes to underreporting and inadequate responses. Cornishia's case demonstrated that lethal violence occurs across all relationship types, underscoring the need for equal recognition and protection. Statistics reinforce the broader issue. Research shows that victims are at heightened risk of homicide after filing a restraining order. Studies indicate that up to 20% of domestic violence homicides occur shortly after legal protections are sought. The period following the issuance of protective order is often the most dangerous, as the abuser may feel a loss of control and respond violently. Cornishia's murder fits within the statistical trend, as she had sought both a restraining order and legal remedies in the months before her death. The justice system continues to face significant gaps in protecting victims who repeatedly report threats. Resources for enforcement are limited, and coordination between courts, law enforcement, and victim services is inconsistent. Bond hearings frequently focus on legal technicalities without adequately assessing the threat posed to specific victims. Restraining orders are often treated as paperwork rather than active safety tools. Advocates argue that a more effective system would include enhanced monitoring of high-risk offenders, immediate consequences for violations, and more rigorous assessment of danger during bond hearings. The Perkins case is an example of what happens when these measures are absent. When the case against Shakyia Perkins reached its conclusion, the courtroom heard an admission that brought legal finality. Shakyia entered a guilty plea to the murder of her wife, Cornishia Perkins, who was shot in the head in November 2022. By avoiding trial, the plea deal meant that jurors would not weigh evidence, cross-examination would not unfold, and witnesses, including family and children, would not have to testify in court. The guilty plea established responsibility directly from the defendant's own words. The sentence imposed was life in prison with the possibility of parole. Under Georgia law, this does not mean permanent imprisonment without review. A life sentence with parole means a convicted individual must serve a minimum of 30 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. At that point, the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles evaluates factors such as the severity of the crime, criminal history, behavior while incarcerated, and input from victims' families before deciding whether release is possible. Parole is not guaranteed, but the door remains open. For Cornishia's family, the outcome provided a measure of justice in the form of accountability, yet questions remained about whether the punishment was proportional to the crime. Public records do not confirm detailed statements from every family member, but in general, relatives of homicide victims often weigh whether a parole option feels sufficient given the permanent loss of life. The outcome left them with the knowledge that parole hearings could one day reopen the case file and bring the possibility of Shakyia's release back into public discussion. Looking forward, the next stage of this case lies in future parole hearings. When the time approaches, the family will have the right to submit statements, attend hearings, or otherwise communicate their position to the parole board. Advocacy groups that focus on domestic violence victims may also use the case to push restrictor standards at parole review, arguing that repeat offenders with violent histories should not be granted release. The possibility of parole ensures that the case will not remain fully closed, but rather revisited decades later in another legal setting. Even with the guilty plea and sentencing, the case leaves unresolved issues that extend beyond the individual crime. The first question is whether this tragedy could have been prevented if the restraining order against Shakyia Perkins had been effectively enforced. Prior to the murder, court records show that a protective order was issued after Shakyia burned Cornishia's Mercedes-Benz and engaged in threatening behavior. That order required Shakyia to remain at least 200 yards away. Despite this, she was able to confront and ultimately kill Cornishia inside her home. Enforcement mechanisms for restraining orders often rely on victims reporting violations and law enforcement acting swiftly, but gaps remain. This case illustrates how a legal order, without constant enforcement, does not always guarantee safety. The second question concerns why bond was granted in the first place given Shakyia's violent history. At the time of the murder, she was out on a $70,000 bond related to aggravated assault, arson, terroristic threats, and criminal damage to property. Courts are tasked with balancing presumption of innocence with public safety when setting bond. But critics argue that in cases involving repeated violence, bond should be denied or set with stricter monitoring. Allowing release, even with conditions, created the opportunity for continued contact and escalation. A third question focuses on whether warning signs were ignored by authorities. Domestic violence incidents in this relationship spanned years, some occurring in front of children, others resulting in criminal charges. The stalking behavior and social media postings in the days before the shooting suggested potential danger. Yet these warnings did not result in preemptive action that might have prevented the fatal outcome. The oversight raises the issue of how seriously authorities track patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents. Finally, accountability extends to courts and law enforcement. Did the system fail to prioritize Cornishia's safety? Were resources such as GPS ankle monitoring, regular bond compliance checks, or immediate incarceration for violations considered and dismissed? These questions highlight not only the decisions made in this specific case, but also the broader limitations of how domestic violence is handled within the justice system. When the gun was fired inside Cornishia Perkins' home, it ended a life, but also revealed the silence of a system that had multiple chances to intervene. The silence before the gunshot was preceded by the silence of bond violations that went unaddressed, protective orders that went unenforced, and repeated incidents of violence that did not trigger sufficient action. The case illustrates how silence, both literal and systemic, can shape the path to tragedy. Cornishia's legacy extends beyond the crime itself. She was a mother, raising 4 children who must now continue without her presence. She was also a friend, daughter, and member of her community. In telling her story, the focus remains not only on how she died, but on how her warnings, protective measures, and attempts to seek safety went unheeded. Her case becomes a cautionary record for others in similar situations. The broader questions force society to confront the dangers of ignoring domestic violence red flags. When restraining orders are treated as symbolic rather than actively enforced, they can create a false sense of security. When courts grant bond to individuals with documented patterns of violent escalation, the risk to victims increases. When law enforcement treats repeated threats as isolated events rather than part of a pattern, opportunities to prevent fatal outcomes are lost. This case forces hard questions about justice, protection, and prevention. Justice was served in the courtroom through a guilty plea and life sentence, but protection failed at multiple points along the way, and prevention was absent when it was most needed. The lesson is not confined to one family. It speaks to the larger public about how domestic violence cases are evaluated and managed. Cornishia Perkins' death underscores a central truth. Legal paperwork cannot protect without enforcement. Courts cannot ensure safety without stricter decisions, and communities cannot ignore warning signs without consequence. Her life and death demand continued discussion, not only in parole hearings decades from now, but in the policies and practices that must change today. If you found this story as gripping and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. And if you want to hear more true crime stories that uncover the mysteries behind these tragic events, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss our latest stories, updates, and discussions. Thank you for joining us on this journey to seek justice and explore the truth. Together, we can make a difference. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.